Welcome to Careers Takeoff, where you learn the latest about how you can get ahead in your career. I'm your host, Conrad Chua. Welcome to this episode of Careers Takeoff. I'm your host, Conrad Chua. Before we get started, I want to remind you to put your questions in the comments field, whether you're watching us on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook. You can start by writing down where in the world you're watching this from. Today, we are talking about AI. It's a field, a technology that, I know very little about, but I do know enough to know that it's going to change many parts of our lives, and it's going to change how businesses are run. So I'm so happy to have a great panel of guests to tell me and you what's AI all about, what do businesses need to know before they jump in, and how the panel themselves have made that career transition into AI. First, we have Lukas Kruger, whose career started in audit, cybersecurity, automation, and he's now the director at Deloitte, looking at good, trustworthy AI governance. So, welcome, Lukas.
Thanks, Conrad. Hi, everyone.
We are also joined by Michael Birdsall. Michael is actually, like me, a resident here in Cambridge, but today he's actually joining us from Washington, D.C. He's also the only member amongst the panel today who's ever worked in a nuclear submarine. Michael joined the Cambridge MBA and after that started a company, Two Sigmas, which used AI very extensively. He then ran data products at TESS, and most very recently, he's started a company to manage performance metrics and subscription businesses. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Conrad. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and we were also supposed to have Simone Larsson, who did an MBA several years ago and is an AI evangelist with Data IQ, but she just sent a message to say she's unfortunately stuck in the real world where basically a train between Manchester and London. So she unfortunately can't join us today. But let's just start off with maybe a discussion really about what is AI? What does it mean to both of you? Would either one want to start?
I'm happy to have a go first. So I think it's an interesting area where if you Google what is AI, you'll get quite a few interesting observations where we often run into the challenge of the need to define it for an organization is where they start looking at either what should our strategy be for AI and how do we govern it. And it's interesting in those dynamics, suddenly you bump into, is AI only machine learning or is AI only automation? Or what exactly is AI in that case? So broadly speaking, I won't go into all the sort of academic references of it, but you have sort of general AI, which is a lot more about trying to simulate and emulate human behaviors and knowledge and thinking. But in the most cases, if we refer to AI in corporates nowadays, it would be narrow AI, mostly defined within machine learning and a number of other areas of derivatives of where machine learning has been used effectively. So that's sort of a useful, I'd say, almost a working definition of it. It continues to evolve. And then one of the other interesting dynamics to mention is the more people accept and get used to where AI is used, the less people think that is AI at work, which is an interesting definition where we see that sort of definition of what you thought might have been AI 10 years ago, which significantly differ from what we see AI being today. So that's sort of a few useful nuggets to keep in mind.
Thanks, Lukas. Michael, any thoughts about that definition or what you think is AI?
I think I agree with everything Lukas just said. I just sort of add that very often once we start talking about AI, people tend to focus on statistics and likelihoods and all of that. But there's also a type of AI that the outcomes are really just decision trees. It's just this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this. And that's been around for years in just procedural code. So it can be the complicated neural nets that you're hearing about, but it can be a lot of if-then statements. Both of them in my mind are AIs.
So, Lukas, if I turn to you, you've got a lot of experience trying to work with companies on AI projects or AI strategies, etc. So, what's your experience in terms of how companies perceive AI in terms of making it an integral part of their business strategy and operations?
Thanks, Conrad. I think in terms of where the organizations are, it's interesting how it starts playing into they define a business strategy and they think of how they're going to achieve it. And AI is then often sort of part of the CTO agenda or the CIO agenda in terms of how they plan to use technology. Data quite quickly starts to play a role, and then you have technology and data at stake. And within that mix, it's where the AI definition comes in, or what's our AI strategy. So it's quite a broad sense then, where suddenly you're already 2-3 levels removed from the direct business strategy. And that's often where you do get organizations where AI happens, but nothing ever hits production because they haven't thought about how it definitely sort of matters to the business. So I think it's one of those areas that, as an organization, helps or thinks about defining what it means, thinks about how it is to be used, just to keep that close link on what is our business outcomes we are actually looking to achieve. And I think all of us are guilty working in AI, where oftentimes things are so interesting, although the value output have not necessarily been thoroughly thought through in how we will be using it or how the business plans to adopt it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about the organization, the structure, and the people, the capabilities to be able to really get the most out of AI without, as you say, getting the wrong kind of headlines. What do you think in terms of like that whole C-level part of, you've got the chief strategy officer or the COO, and we've got CTOs, chief technology officers. Some places have chief data officers, but do you see a chief AI officer, or is it the case that one of these functions are going to have to expand to cover the use of AI in businesses?
It's an interesting one, and I think similar to cybersecurity, where there's always the question of where these sort of maturing and quite recent technologies start to shape businesses. There's always a question of, do we have the right level of seniority around the table where the decisions are made? At this stage, I'd probably still say the AI strategy and all of AI would sit within that CIO remit, within the CTO remit, and not necessarily bubble up as a separate area, not within the short term, unless I'd say AI is integral and inherent to your organization strategy, where that might sit within the CEO's remit, for example, where they might actually be driving that agenda. But in many of your very large organizations, where I'd almost say AI is an enabler to different business outcomes, it sits mostly within the CIO part of the organization, and they would look after how that is being adopted across the organization. There's always, I think one of my colleagues often say, and if things go wrong, the CFO might end up with it, where it's often because letter AI could also easily be similar to cybersecurity, be an area of significant investment. And after a year or two, the question is asked, what was the benefit? And it's difficult to articulate the benefits. And if that isn't kept in check, that's where they often say the CFO might get quite actively involved in where's this money going? What are the benefits we're trying to achieve? So it's an ongoing conversation in terms of where they sit and how it plays out.
And we all know never get the CFO involved in the discussion. So yeah, Michael, over to you. What was your experience at TESS in terms of how that organization looked at things like data and AI in strategy?
Yeah, so I like the idea that it's sort of not clear. Is it between the chief strategy officer, the CTO, or a chief data officer maybe? And I think the answer is wherever decisions are made, because the output of an AI is a decision. It's an assistance with a decision. And so if the decisions are strategy decisions, it should sit with the strategy officer. If it's making decisions about technology, like a spam filter, it should sit with the CTO. But if it's something like integral to your product, and it's going to change your user's experience in some bit of software, then I think it probably should be with a CDO or chief data officer, because the decision-making process doesn't have to be technology. And just because it is technology doesn't mean it should sit with a CTO. I've often said, saying that data and AI sitting with the CTO is like saying anyone who uses a calculator should report to the CFO. It doesn't work that way. It's just the technology that enables the decision.
Yeah, cool. So we're going to talk about data soon, and maybe I'll ask Michael to lead off. But I wanted to use this time just to give a shout out to people who are watching. So we've got someone watching from Copenhagen. Lynn is in Beverly, Massachusetts. Obi's watching from Lagos. Rikako's from watching us from Silicon Valley. Kota is in Tokyo, and actually Ramon, who's a student as well, is in DC, so close to Michael today, where Michael is today. And we've got Alif watching from Indonesia. Yalo, who's I think you've watched a couple of live streams with us, so thanks very much. Welcome from Port Moresby in PNG. Ramia's watching from India. Dr. Shrika is also watching from India. We've got several EMBAs actually. Jintintas here watching from the UK, and Daniel. We've got some. There was another EMBA somewhere down the line. I couldn't quite tell. But anyway, Daniel, welcome from Lagos, and Dan from London. So let's talk about data, which obviously is the oil that fuels, or the energy that fuels AI. Michael, what's your take on data based on your experience, first with Two Sigmas and later with Tess? How should companies start to approach the use of data?
So I think data quality will directly result in the AI's quality. So if you're going in this direction to use AI, you really have to think about your data quality. And I think sometimes companies rush into it. They just take quite a lot of data and they're like, I can use this data to infer some sort of outcome. And I would suggest that after that doesn't work and the CFO maybe gets involved, what you want to do is take a few steps back and think about how that data represents whatever it is you're concerned about, how you structure the data in such a way that it can produce the outcomes that you want. So if I was to try to represent something like we spoke about, like a map, you could do it with longitude and latitude. You could do it with elevations. You could do it with whatever. It really depends. If you're going hiking for the day, then you want to be concerned about the elevations on the map. If you're launching missiles, longitude and latitude is good enough, right? So I think it's just thinking about what the purpose is and how the data is structured to represent it first. And it's one of those planning stages that's easy to rush past, but you'll never get quite as much value as you would if you slowed down and represented whatever it is you're trying to represent well with the data to begin with.
Yeah, and I think, Michael, before the show started, we did talk a bit about how, to borrow a military sort of term, the map is not the territory, and you have to be careful that the data might tell you something in one context, but to be aware of the limitations, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, sticking with the map, you can have a map of your backyard, and that might tell you where the property lines are, but if you start digging without knowing where the utilities are, it's really not worth it.
Lukas, before we go to you to get your ideas, your thoughts about how companies should approach this data process, I want to just remind people to put in any questions that you have for Lukas or Michael. You can even talk a bit about your own experiences working in companies or business organizations. How have your organizations approached AI, adopted AI? Maybe some of the questions that you're faced at work, thinking about data and AI. But Lukas, over to you. Do you see companies going through that kind of process that Michael mentioned, thinking about, well, what is the data that I need? How am I going to get it? And what is it going to tell me?
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting is I see at a stage, I'd almost say many years ago, people refer to data versus information, right? And it's interesting that I feel like data is being used more than information nowadays, and it's not trying to read too much into it, other than there's a common consensus that there's a lot more data than we are able to analyze. So we often refer to not necessarily information management even more. It's just data management, because it's almost like people have given up sometimes to try and just manage the end game, but to manage that whole process. It's not called information lifecycle management, it's called data lifecycle management, of which information is the end state. So there's a sort of a full appreciation that the process has become as important as just the end state. So in terms of how we get there, I feel also then over the last few years, probably 2-3 years, there's even a further, I'd say, stepping back towards, before we even start managing the data, should we be managing this data? And that's something that's come into AI governance often, and data governance is privacy and so on. Is, oh, should we even be collecting this data? Because say 10 years ago, you could probably collect a lot more data without being concerned about how you're going to use it. Where you are now, even before you want to start your exploratory data analysis, you need to think carefully whether you have collected the data for the right purposes, whether you are sort of in a coherent way able to express what you're going to use that data for. So oftentimes what we now look at is, as it pertains to your whole data lifecycle journey, a lot more emphasis and focus on the ethics in collecting that data or starting the journey. We've often spoken about, if we think of data governance or AI governance, someone might think, I need controls across my data science team, as opposed to sometimes the controls shouldn't exist there. They shouldn't even be seeing some of the data you're trying to control, because your governance prevents the misuse of data before it ends up in a place where we shouldn't even be exploring a use case like that, which data science might be looking at. So it's an interesting dynamic in that data lifecycle management piece has just grown in importance, with the chief data officer growing in importance, trying to define data domains across the organization, getting owners for the data domains, actually data stewards for each of those domains. Very interesting dynamic where accountability starts playing a big role in organizations. Say, who's actually the owner for this data? Who would be on the hook for if something goes wrong, or if data quality is just very poor in this area? I think linked to one of the items Michael mentioned in terms of data quality being so important if you want to leverage that data in other use cases. So it's interesting how that conversation is growing in importance, growing in how comprehensive it has become across the organization. So that's a few thoughts that we've come across.
I mean, it's an interesting point you say about should a business even be collecting that data to begin with? Because is it necessarily the case that if a business chooses, for privacy reasons, not to collect data, then would it be at a competitive disadvantage to a competitor who takes the data, gets more data, and be able to better train their AI to better compete? Would that be part of the sort of thinking dynamic as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touch on a very key point there in terms of where some organizations are explicitly choosing not to wander into the area of leveraging their users' data. One organization that we worked with that look at deliveries, for example, they said actually the nature of our data is not as sensitive, but equally, even though they could therefore probably use it, they decided not to use it due to not wanting to stray into the sensitive nature of location data, people, orders, and so on, where many other organizations might move the other way, but they are very protective of it and locking it tied down, not sharing it with anyone, which is absolutely a competitive advantage. And that's where your sort of privacy regulations often plays in two ways. On the one hand, it prevents someone from sharing data, which they keep the competitive advantage, but it also prevents other people from actually competing and removing the control that organization has over an individual's data. So it's really a difficult one to compete in the market often for organizations is, do you take the view of, give me your data, I'll protect it? Or do you take the view that you can trust me because I'm not going to take your data? So it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, Michael, what are your thoughts on this? Is it the case that it's the big corporates who can afford to say, well, my reputation is really high, so I won't go down this data collection route? But is that also the kind of thing that you see in startups, where maybe they really need to fight for every competitive inch, and they will think maybe the balance is more towards data rather than privacy?
Yeah, I think that's right, Conrad, if you don't mind me saying it just like that. And some of that comes from the regulatory framework, where the consequences are much bigger for a large corporate than they are for a startup. Startup can take these chances. there's an idea sort of catching on, I would say, over the last couple of years, that data should be thought of as having network effects, just like multi-sided platforms or something like social media. So if I have data on one person, that's worth some small amount. But once I have data on two people, it's worth exponential growth. Well, actually, that's linear growth still. But we add one more person, we'll get to the exponential. So the idea is it creates so much value so quickly. Even if you're a big corporate and take this stance, there's a risk of being disrupted by a startup. And that startup can get to a point where they've already proved something works in the marketplace. So that financial risk that comes with it, the production costs and everything, that's already mitigated. And then they can bring in someone just to manage GDPR for them when they already have a working AI product. So I think corporates are at a disadvantage right now. Larger companies are at a disadvantage compared to startups.
We do have a question from Kota. Kota asks, Kota agrees that governance is important for data quality and better decision making, but would strict governance actually slow down the speed of decision making? And how do you balance all of this? Maybe it almost goes to what, Michael, you were saying, this whole competitive dynamics. Lukas, what's your take on this question?
Yeah, very interesting. And working in risk, we often come across this, right, in terms of, is governance slowing us down? And every risk individual will tell you it's part of the journey. And then we, as a service line, actually have the slogan of risk powers performance. And there's an element of truth in that you would be able to take more decisions and leverage your data better if you know what are the risks involved. And governance is more about risk management. And it's interesting, governance not being towards, I'd almost say, the means towards an end, is risk management is where you want to be. Governance is not the ultimate outcome of having that sort of governance as the ultimate. And that's often where organization need to find the balance. What is appropriate governance given the use case or the risk inherent to the use case being considered? And that's where the balance lies. And similar to what Michael mentioned about a startup, is it's often that plays in. The risk for them is a lot lower in certain conditions of which data they use where. So it's appropriate. What is appropriate for that level of governance? Where if you have a multinational large corporate, the risk is very significant. And what is appropriate level of governance? It's a difficult balance to find, because oftentimes it might be seen as polar opposites as opposed to a risk-enabled conversation. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, Michael, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think when you start a governance process around your data, it will slow things down. There's no doubt about it. I think the better educated your data team can be, it will actually speed things up after you get used to it and you just accept that you have to do it. A good example would be one of the teams I worked with. We came up with the idea of embedding the sort of level of permission we had with the data, the intended use of the data, in the metadata itself. So you could imagine each column maybe in an Excel spreadsheet, that at the top of that column, we'd have how we could use that data, maybe it could be used for broad marketing, but nothing specific or whatever. So we came up with a few parameters that allowed the team to have governance built into the way it ran. I'd say if you can think of governance as just a fact of life, you'll just get there sooner. And if you can get past the arguments and the uncomfortable feelings around having to bring in a new process very quickly and just accept it. Trust your teams, make them problem solve, they're problem solvers, and just make it part of the process.
All right. I think this is a good time to segue into this chart that Lukas very kindly shared about the kind of trust framework that they use in Deloitte. Lukas, do you want to tell us very briefly, what are these 6 pillars that you have?
Yeah, no, brilliant. And just if people is interested, at the source link at the bottom, this is public facing information. So it's out there and visible for anyone to really have a look at. We have loads of more detail below this, of course, but it's a useful way to structure some of the conversations or considerations. If I quickly sort of move through top left-hand side, fair and impartial data. So that's typically where bias comes in. So when people talk about bias, that's typically the home of where bias is mostly considered. And what then becomes apparent is as you look at, oh, but there's so many other things to consider, is that depending on where your interest is or your exposure or your risks, you might be looking specifically at which of these are the most important for you or for your organization. If I briefly jump towards on the bottom right, safe and secure and privacy, those are typically two items that have been around for quite some time. If we think privacy, cybersecurity, people sort of know what you talk about. So as it relates to AI, I'd almost say the first thing people think now is bias, fairness. Is it fair? The second one is then people might refer to the default things that has been known for quite a while, privacy and safety and security. And then the other three here, so if I think top right, robustness, middle left, and bottom left, and I'll touch on the top right now, those are items that are not necessarily as well defined or often by technology teams or by organizations in terms of what does it mean to have a robust and a reliable model, for example. How robust is your model if there's data shift that happens? How robust is your model if your user population changes over time? So there's a number of areas that sort of what we often refer to as the sort of decision line, or what's your there's a number of technical aspects of it that we could look at. But in terms of how does that actually hold true if it changes in how you use your AI models or your machine learning algorithms. If I take the left-hand side, transparency, middle, transparency and explainable, often overlooked as well. And this is a really challenging one because we have a number of open source libraries that would maybe help you to explain, and you have sort of global explainability versus specific use cases that you are considering. But then the question is it explainable to the data scientists or is it explainable to the public? Which is quite a different one. And then it's a question of, but to what level do you need to be educated on a specific algorithm to actually understand it themselves? And that applies even to the data scientists. So what Michael mentioned earlier is that's where there are often a preference for simpler models that is also still considered AI because it's explainable, because it's transparent. We know how we got to the answer. So we saw a number of shifts over the last 2 years where people prefer to have a model that is explainable versus maybe one that is slightly more accurate, but actually we're not sure how it would behave under certain conditions. And then bottom left, very, very interesting one, responsibility and accountability. Probably still hasn't been solved, like many items on this slide probably, is who would be responsible for that model. So in many organizations, it is seen as the product manager owning a product might be responsible, although the data scientist building the model might be thinking they may be responsible, but once it moves into production, they might see their job done. So it's an interesting one there. And then as soon as you have a product manager, the question is at an organization level, how do you allocate or how do you keep responsibility and accountability across the organization if something goes wrong in the public domain? Who needs to actually own up to what went wrong and who? Because the CEO wouldn't know where AI is necessarily used, which it is a question of should they actively know where it is used and what models are being used. So it's an active conversation, and some of the new regulations, such as the EU AI Act, which is currently in process really, does define some of these things, and there's a few interesting points there. But part of the UK National AI Strategy, there's also a number of other things being considered, and globally there's so many frameworks out there that's currently being pushed, and we'll see over time which framework is considered, let's say, quite robust and applicable across the world, and which the regulator might start picking up some of these frameworks. So that's sort of a brief tour across what some of the things that we've defined as trust, and there's a number of other aspects that people often fold into this.
That's really interesting, and I think there's lots to unpack here. But maybe if I start with a question here about this principle of being transparent and explainable. If AI is going to change the way a business is run, how do you balance this commitment or responsibility to have transparent and explainable AI to your customers versus the need to maintain that competitive advantage and not get it out there so that a competitor could just latch on, maybe use some of this? Is it a case that you have to open up your code, be very transparent about the data? What is it that you need to be transparent about?
Yeah, well, once again, so much depth in terms of what you could do versus what you should do. What's an interesting dynamic we have seen, I think last year, November, December, UK public sector published a UK algorithmic transparency standard in a draft state, which looked at what are some of the things you might want to, in the public sector, actually expose and show where you are using algorithms. It was quite groundbreaking in terms of the public sector taking the lead in publishing that, because oftentimes in the private sector, we see they would lead the way in certain aspects, although this space of providing that transparency is still a massive challenge for many private sector organizations. To your point, in terms of competitiveness comes in, am I giving our secrets away of how we operate, how we use people's data? It's interesting in the standard, they have defined different levels of transparency, and it depends on the use cases. So one of the other items that we have discussed with clients are how would you look at specific low risk use cases, which you may be happy to share transparency on, versus high risk fraud use cases. Should you be sharing something with your users or the public, or sort of how do you go about managing that? It's interesting that once again a risk-based approach comes in terms of what you might want to reveal, but overall that transparency, building trust, we will see in the longer term will play quite a big role in how do you build and maintain trust with your users. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, Michael, any thoughts about this dynamic, as Lukas says, between being transparent and then also trying to maintain that kind of advantage?
Yeah, I think the right thing is to focus on the user, right? So whether it's in a commercial product, it's your customer, or it's in the internal BI system, it's helping find something internal to the company, right? There's, I guess, in industry, we often say just don't be creepy, because once you start getting creepy, you know that's not going to go down well, right? And I think a good place to look for transparency that doesn't give too much away, but gives customers an idea of what's going on, is how Amazon explains its recommendations sometimes. So Amazon will say, based on the products you've looked at, other people who've looked at those same products are often interested in this, right? And that really quite nicely summarizes how a recommendation engine, a type of AI, works. Users who tend to look at the same products tend to also buy the same products, right? But it doesn't get into exactly how they've built that AI. It doesn't get into quite a lot of the quantitative things, and you don't need to know them to understand that. And it's also not creepy in the sense of, hey, they're just saying other people who bought the same things I did tend to buy this. To me, that's no different than when you're buying hot dogs in a grocery store to have the ketchup and mustard right next to it, right? Because people who buy hot dogs are going to buy ketchup and mustard. So I think there's a way to say it and explain it to people that makes it understandable, and that you kind of have to just, one, don't be creepy, do explain it, and two, try to put it in terms of we're putting ketchup and mustard next to hot dogs, not we've got some recommendation engine with 3,000 data points on you and whatever, right? Like there's a common sense way, and it's hard to get there, but when you can, I think people do start to trust you.
And I'm not sure, thanks Fred for this comment about it's equivalent to making oneself blind to avoid excess of light. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. So Fred, if you could just put in maybe some clarification in the comments, and we'll come to your comment. But we did have a question here from Jithindas. And Jithindas asks, how do we make sure we have fairness? What is fair? How do we come to a consensus on what fairness means? I have a feeling your answer is going to be it depends, but who wants to take this issue of fairness?
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a first go. So we have one of our tools that we've built actually have 6 fairness definitions built into it, for example. And I think it's less about getting it academically right, as opposed to what would be a reasonable person or your users potentially expect. And then I'd say it's not then once again of meeting exactly the expectation, but it's, are you comfortable explaining to someone how your outcomes have been assessed or tested? So I think it's less about having a right answer of this is a fair outcome for everyone, because I think there is a place where there will always be someone that might perceive it as not fair, given different perspectives on fairness. So that's my initial take on it. Michael, I think you wanted to come in on that one as well.
Yeah, I often have a similar sort of view. This word bias, right? So when you hear bias, the context is really, really important. If you're working in finance and you hear people talking about bias, it probably has something to do with behavioral finance, and it has nothing to do with necessarily fairness of outcomes. Right? It has to do with how you're looking at things. Or I think I saw earlier something about bias in historical data that could also be a sampling problem, right? So you can have biased samples, right? So it's one sort of start with the word bias. It has a lot of different meanings. And then when you talk about fairness among those different biases, it blows up even greater. I think we worked on a project to try to ensure that we had this concept of equality of opportunity. So if you were sending out a promotion using demographic data to make sure that, say, a recommendation engine didn't recommend to one demographic more than it recommended to another demographic, which ultimately leads to people getting cheaper prices, right, for things. So I think you have to say, okay, well, we want to create this equality of opportunity. Other ideas around equality of outcomes, or whether you want something to be directly related to the amount of effort that's put into it. They're all different ways of thinking of fairness. But I don't think there's a company out there that uses AI that's not thinking about these things.
All right, cool. I think Fred's come back. So Fred prefers anarchy to governance because it speeds up things. Can you justify not governing the data when there's just so much data out there? What's your views on this? That I guess everybody's doing it. The data is out there. People are actually giving up data a lot of times without knowing it, or maybe they just tick that "I agree" box because I just want to read this web page, right? Without understanding the implications. So since it's out there now, why not use it?
Yeah, I suppose, right, this is getting a little philosophical. So the reality is we have governments to put a check on people's freedoms, right? Like, that's what governments do. So ultimately, yeah, you have the freedom to use data to do whatever you want, and it's government's job to put some checks in place. It's no different than not being able to drive your car at 120 miles an hour. Maybe on the Autobahn you can, I'm not exactly sure. But aside from that, right, like we have speed limits, we have some limits in our freedoms, and it's nothing other than that. I think there's an interesting idea in there, Fred, which is how far will it go? Right? How far will it just slowly erode until the governance is meaningless? Right? And I don't know the answer on that yet. I wouldn't care to guess, but I think we'll be better off with governance than without it.
Lukas.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and as Michael pointed out, there's the question probably alludes to a lot broader ecosystem of how we think about data and organizations operating across societies, really. I don't have much to add. I quite like how Michael succinctly put it in terms of there being the benefits of having governance in place I'd probably say almost for the good of most, as opposed to sort of where there might be fallouts where things go wrong. So trying to manage where things might go wrong or where decisions might cause unnecessary challenges to societal groups or otherwise. And it's an interesting one. I think at a national level, we see countries responding with AI strategies, for example, with two things in mind. The one is where they feel if they leave it unchecked, it might grow into something that is unmanageable. But equally, they want to encourage it by having that strategy and govern the energy into the right channels of where they think it could be of most use. So it's an interesting one.
Cool. I wanted to go back to one of your tenets or pillars from your framework, Lukas, which is about safe and secure. And it's basically protecting AI systems from potential risks that can cause physical and digital harm. I mean, is this basically just making sure our IT systems are okay, or is there more to that than just cybersecurity?
Yeah, so and the reason we have safe and secure is exactly to appreciate that, to the secure being slightly more alluding to secure cybersecurity aspects. The safe one is more about, and we have the, of course, physical and digital harm at the end, um, which is about the extent of the impact, depending on your use case, could be far more broader reaching as opposed to just a secure system, depending on how you use it, depending on whether it's used for benefits allocation, for example, depending on, Michael also mentioned a few use cases. So it's interesting how those items could interplay and whether people are thinking about physical safety implications. I think many use cases might not have physical implications, but there's definitely a few that might have in the future, whether that is allocating energy, for example, or how sort of, and I'd almost say the more autonomous systems start managing some of the things that we might otherwise have fixed rule-based, I want to say behaviors locked in, it becomes more important to consider what are the safety implications if something goes wrong on it.
Yeah, Michael, we mentioned earlier on you've worked on a nuclear submarine, so uh, you're very probably well tuned to how the idea of safety systems and the difficulties when we abstract so much, right? Everything becomes this black box. How do you feel companies or organizations are approaching this idea of being safe and having safe and secure AI systems?
So I think it's at the very, very beginning, and security professionals, especially in IT, they talk about like the surface area of an attack. So how much of your organization is exposed and could be attacked. And certainly with an AI that learns from user behavior or learns from, say, a whole bunch of words on resumes, there are new exploits, new ways to get in and mess up your product, right? Like a good example would be submitting fake reviews on Amazon, right? So if people are giving fake feedback in terms of stars and how good products are, and it makes other products get recommended to people that aren't very good necessarily, and it can break down their AI, and that has an implication in terms of the people who are listing products on Amazon. They don't necessarily sell very well. Somebody who is listing on Amazon with a poor product, they can quickly sort of game the system to raise money for something. So it's an interesting idea that actually you should be aware that when you start using AI, because of this way where users can submit data to your organization, which will update an AI, it's a whole different vector for an attack, and your surface area is greatly expanded.
Yeah, and I think this is what Sairam is talking about, that corporate leadership should not look at, should really take things, cybersecurity, very seriously. I wanted to end off maybe by just having this last principle showing up here, which is robust and reliable. And I find this quite interesting, Lukas, where you say you have to confirm that AI systems have the ability to learn from humans and other systems. I thought that's the whole point of AI. They learn, right? So why do you actually have to put this so explicitly?
Yeah, and one of the key items that this pushes in is what we call the decision boundary. Is if, depending on how many attributes you are training into your algorithms or using the data for, if one of those data points change, how sensitive is it? And that's where you say robust and reliable is whether, trying to think of a practical example, if there was one thing different about me, would I get a different recommendation on Amazon, for example? And then is that relevant? Or is it actually that my model is too sensitive to it? And that's where, so as much as we try and mimic human behavior in what we build, sometimes we have a system that is too sensitive to minor inputs and adjustments. So that's sort of the reliability aspects, and robustness is testing each of our attributes. Are we not training an algorithm that overly relies on certain attributes being present? And we often, I'd almost say the ones that hit the news would be gender biases or age or a number of other areas that play a role. But there's so many others that people might not be testing for, that if they change, how does that affect the scores? As Michael pointed out, AI in statistical models sort of also part of that journey, and whether that's credit scores even as relevant in terms of how readily should some of those data points impact and be associated with some of the outcomes being recommended.
Yeah, cool. And just want to say thank you to Orome, who's watching from Nigeria. Orome is also one of our alums. It's been such a fascinating discussion that we're almost out of time. Just wanted to quickly ask both of you, what's your advice in terms of how people can make that kind of career transition into AI? Should they start learning books? Should they start doing projects? How did you get into this field? Because both of you sort of entered the field when it was still a buzzword, right? Michael, do you want to start first, very quickly?
I would say do pick up a coding language, even if it's for very, very simple things, like just mess around with Python or SQL or both preferably. You don't have to go really deep. You can spend, a LinkedIn course or something quite simple on it. And it's better if you get your hands dirty, but that's not even necessary if you don't want to. So to do that, and you'll always be the cleverest person in the room when they're talking about AI if you focus on what is it exactly it's deciding for us. Just always just bring everybody around that. What is it exactly we want it to do for us? Because it is code. It needs to be very explicit. And so just bringing the conversation back to that, you can always be the cleverest person in the room doing that.
Yeah, cool. Lukas?
Yes, I definitely agree with Michael that depending on your aptitude for some of the coding languages, Python SQL is always quite useful, and sort of to provide some colors, SQL, anything data, sort of grow your data capability, grow your familiarity with it. Python, very useful when you start wrangling data and actually think about driving outcomes from data. If you aren't necessarily technically inclined, I would flag, and that's something we've come across a lot in building our teams and capacity in this area, is similar to tech teams. There are loads of non-tech specific people within a tech organization that aren't coding, product managers, project managers, agile coaches, and so on. And often we think about, if we have an AI competence, we don't just want the machine learning engineers to be in there. We want AI product managers. We want AI ethics people. So it's often think about those angles as well, where I often add to people, if you're not going to get into the coding languages, go for AI product management courses, go for some of the ethical challenges on data management, for example. And data management is also, in terms of avenues into AI, data management is often one that people come through. If it's not, and data management being non-technical in terms of processes, strategic ways of thinking about data management in an organization is also a way that you could move into that slightly more AI focused area. So definitely a few different aspects and areas to move into, but hopefully those are helpful.
Yeah, cool. Thanks very much, Michael and Lukas. It was a great pleasure to speaking to both of you. Thank you to the audience. I sorry we didn't get time to take all your questions or put up all your comments. The show is actually going to take a little mini break. We'll be back in June, and so keep subscribing on YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn to get the latest information about when we'll be back on air. So once again, thank you very much, and stay safe, everybody. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Lukas.
Thanks all. Cheers.